Welcome, Jason, to Techs on Texts.
Yes.
Yeah, this is exciting. When I started this thing, I was like, I'm going to do a bunch of things about Dune, and then I found you through. Well, I found Dune Pod. I'm like, oh no, like there's an entire podcast dedicated to Dune.
Yeah,
and it turns out we have some mutual friends.
We locked that down early 2020.
Now tell me, and so now it's called Escape Hatch, right?
Yes, we rebranded because the podcast was supposed to be at the run up to the release of Denis Villeneuve's first movie, Dune Part 1,
right?
Which was supposed to be in the fall of 2020, but because of the pandemic, it got pushed back a full year, and so we ran out of things to talk about that were just Dune. We covered all the books, all Denis movies, all the major movies from the major stars in the movie in Dune, other movies the cinematographer had done, other movies that the editor had done. We were doing everything, and then it was just eventually I was like, well, I'd like to talk about War Games. That's a movie I love.
Oh, okay.
And it doesn't have anything to do with Dune, and so we just sort of branched out to other movies with a specific focus on 80s and 90s science fiction and genre fiction generally.
Got it.
We covered contemporary films too, though. But the movie that we're covering this week right after Dune is Inception, which is very much kind of our wheelhouse. And so we changed the name to Escape Hatch, both to more accurately reflect that we were going to cover more types of movies, but also because the number of people who are friends of mine who would say, yeah, I know you have a podcast, I just never listened to it because I don't like Dune. I was like, we don't talk about Dune very much anymore. It was getting so frustrating. So yeah, Escape Hatch.
Okay, I will include a link in the show notes.
Yeah,
but before we go further, can you please introduce yourself? I mean, we have some mutual friends,
sure.
But how do you describe yourself and your career?
I think of myself as a product manager. My career is, primarily in tech. As a product manager, worked on and particularly in sort of what I like to say is the text box part of the internet, what people do with text boxes.
Interesting.
And so that's Blogger in the early 2000s, at Google after Blogger was acquired, Twitter after Google, and a couple other different places after that. Notably, the Obama White House was sort of the last place I did, which was a very different kind of tech job, but was still ultimately what can we do to get people to do interesting things with the internet for good? And so, yeah, most of my career is pretty much a solidly product management and tech on the social internet. And then most recently, in the last 8 years, I've had a lot more focus on the intersection of policy or politics and tech. And now kind of am one of these people that kind of can speak both languages, both tech and DC. So kind of travel between worlds.
Awesome. Okay, that's great. And so, yeah, it'll be... I think it'll be pretty clear why you're a good person to have on this podcast, despite the credential of having actually created a podcast about Dune.
Created a podcast about Dune. Come on.
Yeah.
What do I need to do here? Ask me Dune trivia questions. I'm ready. I'm fine. People are bringing me on. It's great. It's a great time now that this movie's out because everyone's anyone who wants what's really going on here? What does this mean? They're I get a lot of texts from friends who've seen the movie, liked the movie, or but how do they get off the worm? And what is the deal? What's or whatever. And so I'm ready. I'm fielding all inquiries.
Okay. Well, so let me get a few things out of the way. So first of all, and I think I should say this on every podcast I do, it's oops, all spoilers. All spoilers, just turn it off if you haven't seen the movie or you don't want anything spoiled. We're going to talk about everything. And then the other thing is that the whole conceit behind this podcast is to understand how technology has influenced people, how literature has influenced people who work in technology and have built the technology that we use every day. I'm having worked in technology myself for a long time and having been a humanities guy in undergrad. I am concerned. I'm a concerned person. That's part of why I started the podcast, that the entire tech world seems to be dominated by people just focused on like optimizing stuff. And I think that literature, we can learn a lot from it. So that's why we're doing this.
That's great.
Well, and actually, so this is the other thing I do every time. So do you consider yourself a technologist? Does that mean anything
Yeah,
to you?
I do. It does. Like I've always been interested in technology generally and the internet in specific. Like I think, having been online since I was 13 in sort of like, St. Louis, Missouri, and sort of seeing BBSs even before there was the internet, but like, it was largely in an academic context then, and sort of seeing BBSing and then IRC and then like, sort of pre-web internet, the rise of the internet, all those different waves I felt was, sort of the most exciting thing that was happening. And felt to me like a portal out of, I had a very happy childhood and a great upbringing and enjoyed school even, and liked, my parents, or, love my mom and, love my brother and everything. But like, was always sort of like, there's probably something else to do than be in St. Louis. Like, just seems like a little boring, like suburban St. Louis.
Right.
And like all of the internet sort of kind of reinforced that idea. Is like, there's a lot of stuff going out there. And like, and so that technology in particular has always really appealed to me. But like more than that, like I'm also like, just like a geek, and like I like, AV technology. It's like why, one of the reasons to start a podcast. And yeah, like just like, I also am I studied astrophysics, and so like,
Oh wow.
I like science, and like, sort of the pursuit of knowledge through scientific inquiry. And yeah, all those things really speak to me. And so I think that's part of being a technologist. I guess I would distinguish myself. I am a technologist. I do not think that all technology and the, adoption of technology is intrinsically good. Like, I do not believe that like the path of technological progress intrinsically is a morally positive one. But that instead, these are tools that we create that have tremendous upsides and also tremendous downsides, and that there is an ongoing dialogue between the people who create these tools and the rest of the world on how we kind of hew them to a reality that we all want to share.
Right. Okay. That's a perfect segue.
That was a lot.
No, it's good. It's good. That's why it's a good prompt. So yeah, let's talk about the spice as technology then.
Let's go. So the spice in Dune, in Frank Herbert's world, there's this event 10,000 years before the start of the book and the movie, the Butlerian Jihad, in which there are thinking machines, and the thinking machines rebel against their human creators and need to be put down. And as a result of this conflict, all thinking machines are banned. You cannot have artificial intelligence in this world.
Right.
And that prohibition against artificial intelligence shapes the economy, the politics, and the reality of Dune. And one of the problems that you have is with space travel, you no longer have machines that can like plot their way through the universe. And then what humans discover is the spice melange on the planet Arrakis, which is unique to this planet. And the spice does a couple things. One, when it's ingested by humans, it extends life. It's called the geriatric spice melange. So it becomes immediately the most desirable substance in the universe, because it's that which will allow you to live forever or a very long time. And two, it extends consciousness, which it is it's a psychoactive substance, which allows people to have limited prescience, and thereby leads rise to the Spacing Guild, which uses spice to navigate the stars, so that they don't have to use computers. So in one sense, the technological story of Dune is both the loss of computing at any sort of powerful sense. There's still some stupid machines, but like any kind of really smart machines, computers as good as we have now would not exist in Dune. It'd be prohibited for sure. and two, the rise of spice as this replacement organic compound technology, which both is a medicine, it makes you live longer, but also is a medium in the McLuhan sense, in that it extends human capabilities,
Right.
particularly consciousness.
Right. And then which is applied. So I'll geek out a little bit more. Like if you go to the sort of the Greek like concept of techne, of applied knowledge, just sort of the origin of technology. So the application of the spice is to be able to navigate space, et cetera, or in the case of Paul, to foresee the future or lay out other plans. And then the other of the beauty of the world of Dune is like you've got the Bene Gesserit,
who also, they're
using genetics.
Yeah,
well, they use the spice, and then they're also using like their knowledge of genetics to create superhumans, or also their knowledge of like manipulation or coercion. I mean, they have like the concept of the voice, which is some skill they're able to apply to get what they want.
They have the Bene Gesserit, which is an all-female sisterhood in Dune, have a few key technologies which are amazing. One is, again, by using the spice, they extend their consciousness that enables them access to their ancestral memories on their matrilineal side. And so they, in order to become a Reverend Mother in the Bene Gesserit order, they ingest a huge quantity of spice. And this, in some cases, like 20% of the time, just kills the person. But for the people who survive, they gain access to these ancestral memories. This access to ancestral memories helps the Bene Gesserit have these very long-running projects in the political sphere. One of which is just generally shaping the direction of the empire subtly through influence and persuasion. There's a Bene Gesserit in every great house. That Bene Gesserit are often married into the great houses and are often the mothers for the next generation of these great houses. So they're insinuated into the political fabric of the world. But the other big project that they're working on in secret, unbeknownst to anyone, is to bring forth the Kwisatz Haderach, which is the universe's super being. A human that will have powers beyond what we've already seen.
Right.
And that is their technological interest as well.
Right. All right, man. This is
and then there's two other significant factions.
The Mentats and
the Ixians.
I don't know about,
the Ixians haven't shown up in the movies.
Yeah.
But the Mentats, again, because of this animating event in the history of Dune, which is the prohibition against thinking machines. One consequence is that is the Spacing Guild, which we already talked about. The other consequence of that is the Mentats, who are humans that train themselves to be human computers. They are able to do computation at superhuman speed. And so they're these super rational beings that are able to like kind of do masterful computations and are masters of analysis and strategy. And they, again, are employed in all the great houses for that purpose. So that's another type of technology. And then the third branch, you have the Ixians, who are from the planet Ix. And the Ixians are masters of technology as we would understand it, like are masters of making things. And some of the things that they make include like replacement limbs and replacement biology. So like, you have like super seeing eyes and things like that. And they also make, and you see in Dune Part 2, one of the opening scenes is the Princess Erlan recording her like live journal blog on this little recording device.
Yeah.
This recording device is a Shiga wire device. And that is an Ixian. That is of Ixian.
That's okay.
So like anything that's like man-made like that is probably from Ix. There's another faction in Dune which isn't seen much and won't ever show up in the Villeneuve, but is very important as an antagonistic element. There's the Bene Gesserit. There's also the Bene Tleilax. The Bene Tleilax are a secretive order who have one of their key technologies are the axolotl tanks, and the axolotl tanks are human cloning. So the Bene Tleilax have access to human cloning, and that's one of their big secrets, and one of the big technologies that they only possess.
Right. They're the ones that produce the infinite potentially iterations of Duncan Idaho and
people.
one of the later books. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So you know who you're dealing with. I've read the first 4 books.
Mm-hmm.
I can barely remember. I've read the first book 3 times for some reason. And I've read the next 3 once.
Right.
After seeing Dune Part 2, the Villeneuve's second yesterday, I sort of feel like the movies, and especially now that he's going to do Dune Messiah, I feel like this trilogy of movies might be the new canon for me. I feel like the movies are so good and explain the story and the characters to me in a much more compelling and clear way. And I also want to talk about the final scene of Part 2 of just Chani just catching the first worm out of town, like furious.
Just done.
It was really good. Like, and it is just such a great like point to end on and to lay up for the next movie. I want to get your take on these movies. Like, how do you feel about them? Like,
yeah, I mean, the reason we were excited about starting a podcast leading up to the release of Dune was both because we were fans of Dune, and obviously, like, you know, you've heard me talk about a bunch of Dune stuff already. I'm obviously a fan of Dune.
Right.
I wouldn't say that, like, I'm also a fan of Star Wars. Like, I'm a fan of a lot. I'm a fan of, you know, LeBron James. Like, I'm a fan of a lot of things.
Right.
I wouldn't say Dune historically has occupied a disproportionate amount of my attention or love.
Yeah.
Since the podcast, like, it's kind of, you know, crept up a bit. But, but like, you know, I've always thought it was a really interesting story. I think one of the things that was interesting about Villeneuve making the movie Part 1 and why we were like, oh, this is worth doing a podcast about, was Villeneuve seemingly had never made a bad movie.
Right.
And you know, and like prior to, you know, he still hasn't, but prior to Part 1, it was just like, it was all bangers. And in particular, his last 2 movies prior to Part 1 were Arrival and Blade Runner 2049.
Yep.
Blade Runner 2049 is divisive for people, but for me, it's actually my favorite Villeneuve movie. Like, 2049, like, totally works for me and was one of the most ecstatic experiences I've had in the theater. And Arrival, I think, is, you know, a lot of people's favorite Villeneuve still, even with Dune being out. And so it was like, okay, this is a guy who loves science fiction and like makes good science fiction movies, and he's going to tackle this body of work in Dune that's been adapted more than once, and there's been more than, you know, there have been double that in terms of failed adaptations of Dune or ones that didn't get off the ground. So it's not as though it's like untouched, but there's no cinematic fandom for it at this point. There's people who are like loyal to the Lynch Dune and like it, but like that's like a very small subset of people. And there's people who appreciated like the sci-fi movies, which I actually think are particularly Children of Dune. The second sci-fi series I think are really interesting and good science fiction, good like televised, you know, science fiction, but they weren't like theatrical release, like, you know, cinematic events, and they weren't done on the scale that Villeneuve works on, and they weren't done with sort of like the Kubrickian approach to filmmaking that clearly animates him. Like when Villeneuve talks about his favorite movies, the first one he always mentions almost always is 2001. It really shows. And so for someone for whom that is also my taste, and this was also a movie that whose source material I loved, we were like, okay, well, let's go. Let's just see what this is going to be. And it turns out they're phenomenal. And they're not only phenomenal for me, for whom this is the wheelhouse of my wheelhouse, but they're tremendously successful and popular. And people who had no familiarity with Dune, maybe aren't even science fiction fans, maybe weren't Villeneuve fans, people are coming out of this Part 2 saying it is the best movie they've ever seen. Like people are having transformative experiences in the cinema. And so we live in just a golden time. Like this is like I'm unaccustomed to this degree of victory in my life.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. I mean, it was, it's funny you use the term ecstatic to describe Blade Runner 2049. I agree. I grew up on Blade Runner. It was hugely important to me. I avoided seeing 2049 because it felt like heresy to me.
How could you do this? Yeah.
Yeah. And then I finally watched it like on a plane and just blew my mind. And, and so, I'm a huge fan of Villeneuve. I agree with everything you just said. I'll say also, I also saw the Lynch film when I was a kid, and like, and loved it. Like, it had a big impact on me. You know, I was super confused, but just like visually, it was so interesting. And I got to hand it to Villeneuve for. I feel like he really honored Lynch, and I actually think there are a few clues, like he was speaking directly to Lynch in this movie. That first of all, like the spaceships being weird, like just like the shapes of the spaceships, and like the costumes being super wild. That was all the stuff that really spoke to me, was kind of like the Baroque, like weird, like fashion and set design. Like that was for me, the greatest thing about Lynch is it was this weird sci-fi movie, but it didn't feel like just like all robots and stuff everywhere. And then when Baron Harkonnen's like left out in the desert, and he's got like ants crawling on him, and there's just like a sort of a shot pretty clearly like of his ear. I'm pretty sure that's a direct call out to Blue Velvet. There's a scene in Blue Velvet where somebody finds an ear. And I was like, this is like the masters talking to each other.
It's either that or Salvador Dali. That's a big motif too, is ants crawling.
Oh, interesting.
Human body parts. But I agree. I think he did want to honor the Lynch. I think you know, he's always been very respectful of the Lynch films. The thing that he said the most in interviews about this is that he really wanted to center the Fremen culture in a way that he felt the Lynch movie missed on. And that clearly was a big project in part 2. And yeah, I mean, I loved the Lynch was an important movie to me as well, for the same reason the book was, and the same reason that 2001, both the book and the movie was, which was, as a kid, when you read those in that sort of 13 to 15-year-old range, and as like someone who's hosted a Dune podcast for 4 years now, like most of the people who are fans of the work encounter it at that age. And when you read something like that and you're at that age and you've been reading stuff like, you know, Narnia, which was a big influence on me. You know, The Hobbit, or like, you know, the Chronicles of Prydain is another one, like all this other like young adult genre fiction. And suddenly you encounter something like 2001 or Dune, and all of the answers are not contained within the covers of the book or within the frame of the picture. This is particularly true of 2001. And you're just like, there's got to be more. Like, what does it mean? Like, how does this work? There's got to be more here. And it's like one of the first times where you can watch something that like feels like it's for you because it's got spaceships or whatever.
Right.
But at no point does Darth Vader say, "Luke, I am your father." Like, at no point are like the plot points that explicit.
Right.
And you're being told what to feel about it. It's instead this other exercise of, you're going to have to go do some work. Like, think about what this means. And I love that. Like, I just love that. I think that's the best. And I think that's what he achieves so well, what Villeneuve like sort of succeeds on so well, improving even beyond the book, because he's able to kind of hit some of these really key points of ambiguity just so satisfyingly.
So it's funny, you just reminded me, I just looked up, I took a picture of the TV. In fact, I just pulled this up so I can see like when this, I did this like 10 years ago. This is 2013, so like 11 years ago. It was, for some reason, I had C-SPAN on. It's like book TV, and the guy on is the Chiron. It says he's the co-author of The International Relations of Middle Earth. So it's like, you know, some guy on C-SPAN talking about you know, policy in the context of Middle Earth. And anyway, Jason, that's you. Like, this could be you.
I should be.
Like,
I need.
You have like.
I would like to be ambassador to, you know, Lothlorien or whatever. Like, I would like to be, like manning or at least staffing the embassy in Rivendell. Like, that'd be great.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm just saying, like, you've got the gravitas. You could be on the History Channel. You're just like clearly like the expert on.
Yeah. Put me in C-SPAN.
Okay. All right. I'll see if I can talk to some people. So let's talk about then lessons of Dune. I mean, I know when we talked, gosh, it was a few months ago, but like your thoughts on how technologists often miss the point of literature.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, this is like my main hobby horse, is that as I view myself as a technologist, I do not view myself as a techno optimist, as it's been defined that like all technology and the use of it and the promulgation of it is inherently positive.
Right.
And I think the folks who fall in that latter camp, who believe that the progress of technology is intrinsically good and any limits placed upon it, whether by governments, taxation, societal norms, or otherwise, is inherently bad. I'm against that. I'm strongly against that idea. And I think not only am I against that, but I think most speculative fiction is against that idea as well. I think in the context of Dune, there's a few points to make. One is, people, when you read this book at 15, Paul becomes the universe's super being, and you're like, I want to be the universe's super. I want to be a 15-year-old. I want powers. I want to be able to control people with my voice and, like win knife fights and, have adventures. Like that's obviously part of the appeal. Herbert wrote this as a cautionary tale. Herbert was, strongly concerned about charismatic features and charismatic leaders and the ability of them to corrupt societies. And a lot of this was rooted in his animus against JFK. But some of it was also just generally the idea that like charismatic people end up corrupting the institutions that they lead. And like, as you read more of Dune, you realize that like sort of, he's got kind of a libertarian streak, but like he really believes that like the only valid form of government is like juries. Like there should just be like massive juries, like where people vote on every decision. This doesn't work, it turns out. But like he's very suspicious of bureaucracies and charismatic leaders who lead them. So Paul, and the fact that he becomes the Messiah, this is meant to be a cautionary tale. And of course, Villeneuve in the third act of part 2 really kind of threads this very cleanly, where we are meant to understand, because Chani is the point of view character, as opposed to the book. In the movie, she's the point of view character. You're meant to understand that like he has chosen a path that is bad and like Chani is disappointed in him. And as you said, she rides out in the desert alone to write the greatest breakup album of all time, and is just like, like we are meant to understand that Paul has chosen a bad path. And when he tells Stilgar, like, to, we're going to lead the rest of the great houses into paradise and execute this this galactic jihad, this is not good. Like, this is not great. And if we get the third movie, you'll find out how not great it is. It's not great. And so that's, I think one lesson that folks misunderstand. We love in tech the charismatic CEO. We're, continually fetishizing the Steve Jobs legend and looking for all of our CEOs to exist in the Steve Jobs model. Everyone has to wear, has to give a keynote like Steve Jobs does. The tech press, to some degree, I think they've gotten over this, but for a long time really helped celebrate these stories of these geniuses who lead these companies you can see so far. And they like, it's similar to Paul. Like, they have prophetic visions. They've seen the future, and we're following them because they want to bring forth these. And if you compare that explicitly to Paul, that's not what you're supposed to do. Like, that is the bad way. That's explicitly bad. And so I think that's like kind of I think that's just a willful misreading of the text. The other place in which I get really exercised about this is with respect to Tolkien, which is also loved by technologists and nerds. Peter Thiel names all of his companies after Tolkien stuff. Palantir obviously is a Tolkien reference. Like, there's all these Tolkien references strewn about Silicon Valley. Tolkien was about as anti-technologist as you could get. If you read his letter to his editor, where he's explaining the project of his world in a preface to the Silmarillion, he's like, the whole point is that there are these repeated falls, whether of elves or men, when elves or men give into the idea of wanting to create something with what he calls the machine, but he means technology, in defiance of the order of the gods. And it's this continual lust for power as expressed through the creation of, whether it's the Silmarils or the Ring or whatever, the Palantiri, that lead people into ruin, that lead not just people, but like whole societies into ruin. Like the fall of Numenor in, the second age of of Tolkien is because the men of Numenor like wanted to become increasingly like were harnessing the gifts of the divine in defiance of natural order through their high art and all their machinations. So it's like he's very clear that like he's anti-technologist, and that's informed by Tolkien sort of being a product of World War I and having seen Europe destroyed through, you know, machine guns and barbed wire. But, you know, technologists just like don't read the end of the book basically, and just like don't like sort of understand that no, this is not to be celebrated. So, but in both of those cases, in most cases, people who write books for a living, who are authors, even if they're writing about technology or science fiction or whatever, they end up having a humanistic core at what they are, how they approach these stories. And technologists get focused too much on the gadgets and the cool powers.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it is like it's purely the temptation of the ring, or or we can bring it back to Dune, like the temptation of the Quetzalcoatl, like of this like supreme being. There's this line in part 2, and I don't remember if it's in the book, it might be, but like where I guess the old Reverend Mother, or the Reverend Mother, you know, that's always accompanying the Emperor. Yeah. She's like, oh, you haven't realized by now that there are no sides. Like Paul's mom is like, you picked the wrong side. She's like, there are no sides. And like the idea being like, it's only about power. But then the flaw being, and I think what we realize, like, and again, Villeneuve has done a better job of explaining this, is that like, to what end? You know, it's like, okay, so you have the power. Like, do you think you're better off like concentrating all this power into like one human mind with human desires? Like, where does that lead?
The Herbert version, the to just fully spoil the books that you've read. Book 4. So like,
I'm not going to read after it. So go, you can spoil everything.
4 is, in my view, I got in a whole fight on the internet about this recently. I don't need to relitigate it. 4 is my least favorite of them because it ends up becoming this like, you know, well, we'll get into it, but like basically Paul is unable to avoid his terrible destiny and leads a galactic jihad against his enemies, and 80 billion people die, and he becomes emperor of the galaxy, but like he feels very sad about it. Paul realizes that there's a way, he has an inkling through his prescient vision, there's a way to further consolidate power and to lead humanity into a new future. But he's like, I've already gone too far. I've killed all these people. And Paul ends up sort of as like this tragic anti-hero in Dune Messiah, and ends up going into the desert alone to die, essentially, and leaves the empire to his sister, Aaliyah, who's unborn in Dune Part 2, and to eventually be inherited as regent, to eventually be inherited by his children. And his children, Leto too, is one of his two kids. He has twins, Ganima and Leto 2. Leto 2 is willing to embrace the vision that Paul was putting aside, that Paul was unwilling to accept. And this is the so-called Golden Path. And the Golden Path is, in typical Herbert fashion, alluded to across like 2 books before it's ever made explicit what this means. And just to skip to the end, what it means is that Leto 2 is going to become part worm. Leto 2 is going to suffuse his body with spice essence such that he can graft baby sandworms onto himself and become a nigh eternal being, because sandworms live very long. And he is going to lose his humanity, lose his human form, and over time, over centuries, become more worm-like, but be able to rule the galaxy for millennia. And in that millennia will hold humankind stagnant, because he will be an absolute dictator. He will control every facet of society, both because of his long life and also because he controls Arrakis and all the spice. And over the course of the years, he will bring greenery to Arrakis and reduce the spice flow. And by reducing the spice flow, there'll be less travel in the galaxy. There'll be less spice available for people to live longer. There'll be less spice available to the Bene Gesserit to, like, you know, perform their rituals. Like, he will constrain, tamp down, be this repressive autocrat, the likes of which humankind has never seen, lives for thousands of years. And his intent in doing that is to kindle within mankind this desire to reach out and explore and break free of the bonds of society and go start new adventures and go explore new worlds in a way that's never been done before, so that when he finally dies thousands of years hence, there'll be this great scattering of humankind and human potential, and this will be the next leap forward evolutionary for mankind. That's the golden path.
Interesting.
Which is weird. Obviously it's very strange. Obviously it's very strange. But yeah, so like that's like Herbert's sort of solution. Herbert's sort of solution is that like mankind has grown stagnant, and in order to kindle new growth, we must first have millennia of despotic rule.
Right.
I don't know. Do with that theory what you will.
Well, it's fascinating. I mean, because so thanks for reminding me, because I'd read through 4. I had some sense. I mean, kind of like where I'd like ended up was that like the golden path was like kind of just like, look, kind of hold my beer, like just you'll see what's going to happen. And that I knew, like, I understood that the notion of like restricting access to the spice and basically reducing humanity to this like feudal state for millennia. But I did not know the purpose. So thanks for explaining that so clearly. And now a lot of people don't have to read these books. Dune,
the 4th one, which is really about the reign of the God Emperor, it's called God Emperor of Dune. Is particularly rough because it both makes explicit this whole story I just told you. So that part's kind of good. Like you get like the kind of payoff for all the stuff that happened before, but like narratively what's actually happening are these long philosophical digressions between the God Emperor and like his major domo, and they're just like literally doing Socratic dialogue with each other for hundreds of pages. And then there's also this weird love triangle between the God Emperor, this woman who's sent by the Bene Tlilax, shout out to the Bene Tlilax, and Duncan Idaho
clone.
Duncan Idaho clone. And so it's, I've always described God Emperor of Dune as Plato's Republic meets Twilight, because it's like equal part like Socratic dialogue about like politics and also this love triangle between a reanimated, like between a clone Duncan, this weird lady from the Weird People, and a worm god. So it's like do with that what you will. That one's not getting made into a movie. I guarantee that will not be a motion picture.
Well, if anyone could
doing that.
No
one's doing that.
Hey, look, never say never.
It'll be like a TV show, because now like it's interesting because now this movie is a real success, and so we'll get the 3rd one when Denny wants to make it, and not like a moment before. Whatever he wants to do, he's gonna go do now. He doesn't want to go do this one next, so we're not gonna get it next. We'll get it when he wants to make it. We're gonna get this TV show, which has been in like development hell. We don't know what it is. It's got Emily Watson in it, and could be interesting. I don't know. But then like, the unblinking eye of IP culture will now turn its attention to Frank Herbert's Dune, and like the steward of that universe is Frank Herbert's son, Brian Herbert, and Brian Herbert has very few Brian Herbert's willing to like tell some stories, like make some shit up about what's going on in the Dune universe, and write like 23 books that are terrible.
That's been my sense. I remember saying, I was like, we should have prequels. Like there's a bunch of like prequel stories that would be amazing. And then of course, like, I don't know if Brian wrote them, somebody's written them, but my guess is that they're terrible. Whoever Villeneuve's working with to write this stuff is who needs to be. I don't know. We've got some real pros in the room now.
The goal is that like, Villeneuve will be like sort of the Kevin Feige of the Dune cinematic universe, and can like help steer what goes to TV and help like, figure out what the next movie is. But like we're at the beginning of this now. We're at the first Avengers movie phase of like, the cinematic universe. But like,
is Feige, I don't know, is that he's the MCU or Marvel
MCU,
cinematic universe? Okay.
He's like the James Gunn runs the DCU, and Feige runs the MCU, and
all right, I didn't know that. Okay, that's good. Well, I'm going to go back though to like the idea of the golden path, the idea of the Kwisatz Haderach and everything like that, and sort of apply this to the Palantirs or the Googles of the world or whatever it is. One, sort of story that came to mind when you were talking about Tolkien and this idea that like the humans or elves were somehow like sort of violating God's rule or the limitations that were put upon them. This is the Tower of Babel, right? So it's like the Tower of Babel in the Bible. People try to build a tower to the heavens, and God's like, "What are you doing?" Scatters them, destroys the tower, and basically creates all the languages of the world, so people can't understand each other, right? So there's this, but that notion of being like, don't get out of your skis, like being put in your place is like it's right there in this ancient religious text. One actually story that I will certainly do a podcast on in the future is Borges. That's called The Library of Babel, where he describes a library that contains basically infinite information, like a book that all the books it could ever. The way that he describes a library, it's not much of a story; it's more of just a thought exercise. But like a library that contains not infinite, it's a finite number, but it's a huge number of rooms that all have these books on them, but the books are all identical in terms of like page length and the number of characters per page, but they just contain every possible combination of characters they could ever. And so most of the books just contain gibberish, but the library does contain everything ever written and everything that ever could be written, in theory. And what's great about it is that it forces you to confront this idea that's like, if you could know everything, you wouldn't be better off. Like it doesn't change, what it is to be human. And I think this is the peril of like the Kwisatz Haderach, or again, Palantir, Google, this idea that's like, if only we could control all the information and know everything, then we would know what to do. That's a delusion, I feel like.
Totally. Like, and that is a particular concept in Herbert, because like the gift of spice to Paul grants prescience. Right. And what we end up, and so you think like, oh, it'd be great to be able to know the future of everything, like be able to see the future. But prescience, the ability to know the future, ends up becoming a prison for Paul. That's one of the things that leads to his real downfall in Dune Messiah, is that he feels completely constrained by having seen so much of the future and having all of this prescient ability. And he feels locked in by that because, it feels like, what is free will in a world in which everything's been predetermined. And that's a real concept in Herbert for sure.
Yeah. And actually, I wonder if you can illuminate this for me, because I just saw the movie yesterday, and I'm like, why did he end up going south? Like, what changed his mind? Do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. One is the brutal attack on Siege Tabor led by the Harkonnens that imperils everyone that Chani and Stilgar love. Like they're all driven out of Siege Tabor, so that like sort of home is destroyed. And including the women and children or whatever, this whole society that he's really kind of he's there. He says at the beginning to like learn how to become a Fremen, and this whole like kind of stronghold of them is completely destroyed, and so he loses the second home. It's the second time the Harkonnens have kind of driven him out from home. Right, the first time when his home in Arrakeen was killed or destroyed in the first movie. Two is he's given another way out besides going south, even with that. Because Gurney Halleck shows up and says, I know I've got power. I know where your father's atomics are. Right. The idea that each house has a stockpile of atomics and this kind of atomic weapon, mutually assured destruction, is one of the ways in which the peace is kept, is both a Cold War concept from when the book was written, obviously, but as a concept in the book. And Gurney says, like we could use these atomics. You could blow up, you can blow up the planet with all these. And Paul has a prescient vision in which he sees the use of the atomics, and specifically that Chani dies as a result of that. Like he sees this like nuclear holocaust with her face getting melted off because of that. So that path, if he doesn't go south, this is going to be one of the other paths that he has to take, is to use the atomics to maintain power and control. It's a very subtle detail. I only noticed it on the second viewing, but this threat to Chani's life that he sees in a prescient vision, as well as the real present threat of the annihilation of Siege Tabor, plus also like Chani saying like, I know you're afraid, but you can stay true to yourself, basically.
Right.
Gives him, it's not so much the confidence. He knows it's going to go badly. He just, there's no other path at that point. There's nothing else to do. It's either he's going to stay up there alone or use nukes and lose Chani, or go south. Like there's no other option.
Right.
Because the rest of the people can't stay up there anymore. There's nowhere to stay. So it's this real forcing of his hand, that I think the movie does a better job explaining than the book even.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. No, I mean, I've joked about, I've said this before, not on this podcast, but like the end of the book to me is just so disappointing. It's like, it feels like you're getting shoved into a wall. It's like, okay, like he married the daughter of the emperor and like, you know, so no, this was great. And then it also, I mean, my reading on this, and it's kind of interesting, like my, my Christian upbringing, like gets shown here. Like I'm not particularly religious now, but like one thing I sort of really admire about Christianity and like the story of like of Jesus, the Christian Messiah, is that like this guy got killed. Like he's like the Messiah shows up. He's like, he gets killed like pretty much immediately. I mean, like I think he like ministered for like 3 years. And his whole message is like, oh, if you want to be free, you should just like love people.
Right.
End of story. Yeah. And this is what's going on in Dune is like, Paul's like, okay, I'm the Messiah. I have to destroy everyone's enemies.
Right.
And he what ends up happening is he turns his back on like the real reality of his life, which is his relationship with Chani. And he's like, no, I'm going to follow this like future of abstractions, an empire, like galactic dominance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, instead of just being present with this person he loves. And of course he's furious, and rightfully so.
And he feels, and I think there's language about this in the book, and in the book Chani doesn't leave. Chani is a more docile character in the book,
right?
And not as much a strong point of view as in the movie, which I think is one of the reasons the movie's an improvement. Like he does all of that. He's willing to like sort of embrace the Messiah narrative, use all of his power to overthrow the emperor, become the emperor himself, because it's a way of like securing safety for her, for his friends and his family, but specifically for her. And in the book, she's with child. Like he knows that like she's gonna
that's
have
right.
his heir.
Yeah, these twins.
Well, he has a little one. There's a baby before the twins.
That's right. Thank you.
And so he thinks that like, he's got to do this for that reason. I think the movie makes a more interesting choice, both by checking out Chani's pregnancy, by Chani not going along with this, to say he's just doing this because he's like he's seen that this is the path, and he's just going to do it. He's like, what's the point in pushing against it? Like, I know where we're going. Let's get to where we're going. And the ruthlessness and the unwaveringness with which he executes the third act of the movie, basically after he takes the water wife, he wakes up and it's just like, let's fucking go. Like, I'll go to, like, I'm going to go talk to these fucking old people. I'm going to scare the shit out of them. I'm going to like unite everyone. We're going to ride north. I'm going to blow up the wall with nuclear weapons. I'm going to kill everyone. And it's just like Hamlet Act 5, it's just like, let's just get it all done. So yeah, it's exciting. I like
it. Is it's incredible performances, and shout out to Zendaya. Like,
she's great.
Whatever.
She really she sells the betrayal so well.
Yeah. This is awesome. Trying to think what else I want to talk. Well, so you don't have to, you have worked with a very charismatic leader. Yeah. And without, I don't need you to tell stories or anything like that.
Maybe the world's most charismatic leader. Yeah.
In my lifetime, I would say so. We're talking about Obama, just for listeners. I forgot about it. Yeah.
We're talking about Larry Page.
Yeah. What is your, okay. So like, I gather we're probably kind of on the same page. We should be very skeptical of charismatic leaders. Certainly that's the message of Dune. What's the solution It's not the golden path. Do you have any opinions on this? Like, how do you feel about this?
I mean, I guess I'm like kind of boring. I think the solution is democratic norms and institutions. Like, yeah, you deal with the charismatic leader problem by having 2 term limits on the presidency and an election every 4 years. Like, I mean, and Obama has talked about that himself in his like sort of, I worked there at the end, the 2015 to 2017.
Okay.
And if you go and look at his farewell address in Chicago in January 2017, and just generally comments he made during that time, both publicly and to staff, there was a lot of like, when Obama was out there, particularly after Trump was elected, and even before, he would get a lot of 4 more years, and like, it's all well natured and appreciated, but he would talk about, he's like, like, look, like there's a reason why like we have people step away. Like, you don't want to have the same people in charge. That never ends well. Like, for people to just be like, I'm just going to stay for a bit longer. Like, that is how you lose a democracy. And so I think that's like a very good stopgap on the system, on those kind of things. Another thing that I found, this is like really insidery, but I was struck by working in the White House, the very strange job that we've given to the president of the United States, where they need to be a policy expert and they're reading binders of information a day. Obama would say, like, only the hardest problems reach my desk, because if someone else could have solved it, it wouldn't have gotten moved up the chain. It's only when it's like, okay, like, what should we do about this, that they have a meeting with him on it. And so they've got to be expert in all of these fields, national security and domestic affairs and like all these different topics. And, Obama is one of, if not the smartest person I've ever met, and processes information at an incredibly high cadence and throughput. But then also you ask the president of the United States to do all of the, like, hugging babies, going to Halloween parties, like all of the stuff, like, making videos for the internet, that was stuff I would ask him to do.
Right.
And it's like all of the stuff that's about being charismatic and about being a figure that people can relate to, and is about, is about like the interpersonal sort of like relationship that people want to have with the leader of their nation. Other countries have solved that by separating the head of state, head of government job.
I was going to say, like a monarch.
Whether in the context of a constitutional monarchy or even in the constitutional republic, like Ireland has, like, the guy who's the head of state in Ireland, the president of Ireland, is this like not very cool, like old poet who has like 2 giant dogs. And like, yeah, it's like, there's other ways to solve this, right? Like we don't have that. And we have the unitary executive idea, which may be like it's a real strength in certain ways, because it allows for a lot of control and a lot of ability to direct a very large unruly nation. But then you also find out when you elect a just straight up crazy, terrible person, that's got a lot of downside too. So I think that's that's one of the interesting things about the Herbert charismatic leader thing, that kind of does play into our system as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, with one sort of quiz I always do on people when having these discussions is to ask people, like, if they know who the president of Switzerland is.
Yeah, I have no idea who the president.
No one knows. Like, they, and the thing is, like, and I'm somebody, maybe people can yell at me, like, there's like a federal council in Switzerland. So Switzerland even has something like 7 or 8 president type figures. But in any case, you never know who the president of Switzerland is, because their democratic process is different. And this is not like a knock on Swiss people. I don't even know if they have a charismatic leader, or what a Swiss charismatic leader would even look like.
Yeah, totally.
It would be a very practical person.
Yeah, I mean, like we're not just in the Trump domestic context, but the problems, the threat of the difficulty with populism generally, is in pretty sharp relief globally right now. Like that's whether you're talking about Argentina or Italy, or Hungary or Russia. I mean, it's all the same kind of problem, that populists can quickly erode democratic norms because of their popularity and their personal the personal cult that kind of builds around their charisma. And that's
Right.
very much a Dune idea. Herbert was no fan of democracy as a representative democracy as a stopgap on any of that. That's
Right.
not his theory. I have a different political philosophy than Frank Herbert, but it's still the same kind of root problem that he was interested in.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about though about democracy and technology. Like
Sure.
I've worked in the Gov 2.0 space, and
Yeah.
was into that. So it's what a lot of my career has been in. And I had this insight somewhere kind of early, and it's around when Obama got elected, and watching the transition from like those 2008, 2007, 2008 campaigns
Yeah.
that were like super hyped up with technology, because back then it was like MySpace, like there's all
Yep.
sorts of
Yep.
all these social media was emerging at the time,
Yep.
and people organizing online was very exciting. And then I was able to I had a front row seat to watching how like, running a campaign is very different from governing a country. Right.
Oh yeah,
And like
definitely.
but there was kind of this assumption, I guess I was naive at the time, that I'm like, oh, like all these people know how to use technology to run a campaign are going to like
Right.
do stuff in the government.
Yeah.
And so it's a completely different function.
Yeah.
And so the application of technology within government, that if we talk too long about this, we'll end up talking about procurement, which I don't want to do.
Let's go.
No.
Let's go.
But what I'm concerned about with democracy is also the technology's ability to manipulate how people think, right? And so the idea, so I'm skeptical. I wouldn't say I'm skeptical of democracy per se. I would say I'm worried about democracy in the sense that like, are humans trustworthy arbiters of their own desires? Like people are less and less likely to make good decisions. I don't know if that's true or not, but it feels that way.
I don't think we fully grappled with or articulated a way out of a lot of societal change happened very quickly. Like I talked about, like sort of how, growing up in St. Louis, I was interested in BBSs. The time between then and now, where you carry the world's information in your pocket, is very quick. I mean, we're talking about like the Clinton era to the Obama era. Like, it's a very quick blink of an eye that feels long to those of us that, grew up in it or whatever. But in the grand scheme of things is not. I don't think we fully reconciled with what it means to be that connected, to have that much information, to have so much information from so many personal points of view, to have so much, even the people that, there's a lot of talk about, it's like, oh, well, it's all the algorithm that like gives people this outrageous content because that's what drives money. I think that's a unhelpful simplification. What I do think is I think what is more important is that the systems that drive information to people, whether it's information platforms like Facebook or traditional ones like the New York Times or, one-to-many things like chat, some of those systems are so complicated in terms of the content that they're surfacing that even the people that built them don't entirely understand what is being amplified and what works. They are stochastic systems that are non-deterministic. And what you get in no way determines what you get out. And the impact of what people see is not the impact based on what people see is not measured except in the context of, did they click on ads? And the companies are not incented to look at questions like, did this promote democratic health, or did this help have people have a better self-image? Those are hard questions for companies to answer because all the data points don't exist purely on their platform, and it's not really their business model to do that. And we haven't built the right structures to kind of answer those questions. So I think like we haven't fully grappled with all of that. And as a result, it's played a big role in some of how we've seen some of the creakiness in institutions that we've taken for granted for these 100 years.
Right. Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And I completely agree. Like we trick ourselves into thinking that it's like, oh, like, sort of what I said earlier, like my job is to make this line go up and to the right. And as long as that's happening, like I'm doing my job right. And it's like, well, there's a lot of other things happening that you can't even measure. Either you're not measuring, or but they might not even be measurable. and we're not going to learn that they're important until it's maybe too late, or
Yeah,
you know,
100%.
or we might, yeah. So you've talked about, you know, the importance of institutions. You know, again, I paint with a pretty broad brush, saying like what technology is, right? Like, I think the way we organize as humans is some form of technology.
Sure.
And so I'm curious to get your take on what kind of institutions we need now. Like, I mean, it seems like
Yeah.
some of the incumbent institutions aren't up for the task.
Yeah.
Do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, for
sandworm?
government, like where I always start is measuring things, like the very unsexy problem of measuring
Right.
things. You know, we were talking. I just said, like, you know, companies aren't incented to look at like what the impact of their products are on people's mental health, their self-image, the health of democratic institutions. Some of those things are hard
Right.
to measure anyway. They involve like data points that are not purely on platform. But there should be some way to make assessments of that.
Right.
It's similar to the question of if you're a car manufacturer, it's probably it's difficult to know just based on the car that you made what impact your design decisions had on all of the accidents and dumb things that people do with cars out on the road, right? Like, you don't have total telemetry on all the cars. You don't have, you know, information from all of the places in which accidents happen, times in which people are looking at their phone, crash into a sign, whatever. You don't have all that information. You know, like, you need some entity to calculate, to measure, to count
Right.
how many highway deaths there are. And then you can say, like, well, there were this many highway deaths, and like, turns out like a disproportionate of them were because of Fords. Like, you know, what's going on
Right.
with you guys?
And
And
this is
then
sponsored by Ford, by the way.
yeah, sorry,
That's
sorry,
right.
Ford. And so it's like, you know, I think like something that like allows transparency and inspection of what's actually happening because of this, if for no other reason than to hold up a scoreboard to the companies and say, like, this is what you're doing. Like, you know, what can we do to make this number go down? I think is a pretty critical first step and a natural role for government to play. And it's more complicated in some of these things than it is with automotive, because you're talking about speech, which is more
Right.
rightfully protected from government, but it's not impossible. And so that's you know, that's one bit of business that I would like to see an institution exist for. I just think generally, you know, look, like, there's a lot of stupid regulations being proposed, stupid laws being proposed for tech, and a lot of them are would be really harmful to people, not just the companies. Like, you know, these laws out of Texas and Florida and whatever. And like, you know, those laws should go away. However, like, in general, I think everyone sort of understands that we allowed the tech sector, particularly in the context of the internet, to kind of just do whatever for a long period of time with very little transparency, very little information. That's led to weird competitive environments. It's led to like a dramatic consolidation of power for a few key players. It's meant that we don't have good answers on a lot of these questions that you and I are talking about now.
Right.
And like that era is going to end. Like, we're done with that. And like, whether that's domestically or in Europe or in other places, like, we're not going to do that anymore. So we're going to try some different things, and we're going to treat like this industry how we just treat industry generally, which is like, yeah, we can be a dynamic, growing, robust economy with really innovative technological tools, new products, lead the world in defining how new consumer experiences enter the market. But we can also, like, you know, make sure that the meat gets inspected and the cars don't blow up when they come off the line, right? You know, and so, like, you know, I think we're just going to move more in that direction over time. I mean, that's like slightly predicated on the American experiment continuing, like, you know, that like a Congress that passes laws, and like a country that's not like led by a narcissist crazy person. But, you know, we you know, gotta, you know, keep, you know, I worked for a hope and change guy, so I'm gonna assume that I'm gonna hope that we get there.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I mean,
yeah,
we can hope. We should continue to hope.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's funny. I'm realizing now, like that was a bit of a leading question, and I didn't really intend to do this, but like that's actually something that we do. I'm just going to talk about my own work. Like one thing we're building at Radiant Earth is this thing called Source Cooperative, where we are trying to basically create the infrastructure for what you're describing in terms of having a place where we can share observational data in a kind of neutral um, way, and it just like have an arbiter that's like, this is where data is shared that everyone can look at. I mean, the name Source Cooperative comes from like view source,
right?
But also my perspective. I mean, your example of like highway desk is a really good example. The example I use is more for like climate data, like global climate models or global weather models, because the other issue that we're dealing with, and this is a good thing, is the internet has allowed us to cooperate at global scale. But there are no institutions that are very good at like gathering data at a global scale. Highway desks are like, sure, the government should do that. It's the government's highway. But there's a lot of stuff now that I think we can be looking at together. But there's really no one around to do that. So
no, for sure.
Anyway, yeah. All right. Well, so any other thoughts on Dune or on the movie that are top of mind for you?
I mean, I think it's interesting. Like one thing I was very surprised having seen the second movie, twice now, but after the first viewing and like hearing, like even when we saw it on Thursday, it was like the critical response was already coming in like so positive, and that the box office projections were, turned out low. Like, it was like, oh, like people are going to go see this movie. And it turns out people saw this movie. It's a deeply weird movie. Like, it's deeply weird. The shit that happens. I mean, I talked a lot about, like, I've given you like some flavor of what's in the Dune universe, like even outside the context of the book. And it's all very weird stuff. And I think previously, like, we kind of thought of Dune as like a weird book for weirdos. And now it's like, it turns out everyone's a little bit weird and is into this thing. And partly that's because of the spectacle of Villeneuve's movie. It's so grand. And partly it's because like he anchors it in things that people can relate to, whether that's like religious epic. It was like, there's a part of this where you could just read this as like, you've seen the 10 Commandments, right? So like, just imagine that, but like with worms. And like, it's like, you can kind of understand how to relate to it. But I also think one of the aspects of why it's working is because it's not glib. It's not there's no like turning to the camera and being like, watch this drive or whatever. There's no like there's like, there's no like Iron Man-ness to this movie. And I think I think there's a lot of reasons why we're in the decline of the MCU. But one of which I think is like people are now interested in like stories that have like an authentic weirdness to them.
Oh yeah.
And I'm grateful to be able to live in that era as well.
Oh, same. Yeah, there's a New Yorker article like I didn't read it, but it was something like critical of the MCU. And for what it's worth, like I don't watch those movies. I've seen a bunch of them, but like it's not my just not into it. But it was something that's like, how did this happen? That like it was like Glenn Close or somebody, like some like very well-renowned actor was in some MCU movie, and it's like, how is it these actors are now in movies where the plot can be summarized as like keep glowy thing away from bad guy? Like like
look, like I run a weekly genre film podcast and I am over it with the MCU, which is probably not a great sign. I think one of the things that we've talked about a lot on our pod is like all movies are miracles to some degree. It takes so many people like for one person's taste to be able to like kind of yoke together so many different disciplines and to end up with anything that's legible, let alone good, is kind of a miracle. And in a lot of cases, some of the movies that, we all love the most have a lot of stories about, well, that was a complete accident. Like we didn't know what we were shooting for here. Or we didn't know where the story was going. We were writing it, as we were filming it. There's a lot of stories like that of movies that are phenomenal. Marvel like kind of bet too much on that. Like they're famous for these reshoots where they don't really know the movie they're making. They don't really have the story. They announce the movie as soon as they have like the creative team. It's like, it's going to be this director and this person. And it's like, but they don't know what the story is. And they don't know what the story is while they're shooting the movie. And then they like screen it, they test screen it, or they look at it. They're like, we need like, let's try again. And they'll do all these extensive reshoots. And it's easy for them to do because, you know, they got all these actors under contract. They're obliged to come back when they're called. They've got the volume. They can just pop everyone in the LED soundstage. And like, you know, they don't have to fly back out to, you know, Jordan or Abu Dhabi or Norway or whatever. They just like do whatever. And like, but as a result, like it ends up becoming this very machined, ill-considered thing. And with Villeneuve, I'm very excited as a genre film fan, as a fan of science fiction in particular. The fact that Denis Villeneuve and Christopher Nolan's going to win every fucking Oscar there is in 3 days. And deservedly. And Denny has the biggest opening weekend since like, you know, Barbie, Oppenheimer, you know, in this movie. These are two people who, when they go to make a movie, they have a plan. They know what movie they're making. Yeah. And it is their taste that is on screen. And I am happy to be back in that era where it is like someone's taste is guiding this. And it is not like, let's just throw some stuff up and figure out in reshoots what works and what doesn't. So it's very exciting. As I said before, I am unused to feeling as a natural kind of catastrophist. I am unused to feeling this victorious. Like, it was just like, the thing we love is great and everyone loves it. How's this possible? So it's great. That's really great.
I'm with you. It's such a thrill. And yeah, it's crazy. I mean, I haven't looked at the numbers, but I'll take your word for it. Like, it's been huge. But the movie was incredible. And to know that there's like people I hung out with some other dads last night. We went and saw Destroyer. Anybody who's a Destroyer fan? He's a musician.
Oh yeah, he's in
New Pornographers.
New Pornographers. Yeah, I've seen him.
I'm a huge fan. But anyway, what point is, we're all talking about Dune, and like people, they're taking their kids, and I'm like, and I was saying like another sort of, I think, like honoring Lynch thing, or I perceive it this way, is going so hard with the Harkonnens being like scary, like just horrifying. I mean, so scary going and the whole like black and white Getty Prime scene just being just insane.
It's crazy. That thing is so show offy. Just be like, how about we shoot it in infrared? You ever seen that shit before?
Is that what was going on? Okay, I was like, okay.
They shot it in infrared, and none of the costumes worked because things read differently in infrared. And so you put black cloth on someone, it doesn't necessarily read black. And so they had to like figure out a whole costuming for infrared. No one's ever done that before. And that's what gives it that very specific look, where the color drains out under the black sun. It's very freaky. It's
the black sun thing. The fireworks stuff that was going on.
Fireworks.
The oil.
The oily fireworks were like just solvent in water filmed up close, which is like a classic. Like a lot of the split screen stuff in 2001 is also like filmmakers just shooting solvents, huffing paint, basically.
Yeah. They love I know that's in like Star Trek, like teleporting and stuff like that was just like water swirling around.
Yeah.
What else? Yeah, going so hard with it. But just knowing that like every one of the countries taking their kids to see this movie with like rendering water out of corpses, like a Holocaust, just like bodies burning everywhere. What a time to be alive.
Weird. It's super weird. There's like just casual cannibals in this movie. Like, Fade like is talking about bringing livers to his like bevy of harpy cannibals. It's a deeply freaky. It's also a very kinky movie. There's a lot of, the vacuum bed stuff, and like the Fate is driven by humiliation and pain. Like it's like, my kids are 5 and 3, so they're too young for this movie. But Griffin, my 5-year-old, knows that like this movie is like a thing for me. And so he's like, I want to see this movie. I was like, I'll show you parts of this movie. I'll show you a couple scenes. I think I could show him from part 1, like the harvester attack, like the sandworm harvester attack or whatever.
That'd be cool.
So I might show him some parts of it, but it's great. I mean, like I like, it's so great, like having a 5-year-old now, because I'm able to like like all my nerdy pursuits are now his nerdy pursuits. And so like, we're playing video games together. He likes Spider-Man. Like, it's just like, it's all happening for me. So I'm very excited that, to be in this phase. And one day he will read Dune and it's going to be great. Like, he's like, I was one of those things where I'm just like, I saw this, there's a tweet or a thread post or something like that, where like, he's like, my 12-year-old daughter came up to me and was like, Dad, like, why don't they just fire guns at the people wearing the shields in the desert in Dune, which is like this whole complicated thing, like physics in the Dune universe. And he was like, how much detail do you want about this subject? And I'm like, that's gonna be me for sure. And I'm very excited.
Well, you should write the book, like How to Talk to Your Kids About Dune.
Yeah, that's good.
And it's like
how to talk to your kids about Dune. Your body's changing. You're becoming an immortal sandworm.
Well, there's also, I mean, look, there's precedent for this with the Bible. I mean, it's like all this like crazy stuff we're talking about the Bible. You're talking about like kinky stuff, like murdering.
Weird. Oh yeah.
The Bible's full of.
For sure.
So
yeah.
So it's a new Bible. All right. Well, this has been awesome. I've had a lot of fun with you.
I'm glad you're doing this. This is great.
Yeah. Well, thanks for joining. And I'll put in the show notes to send
listen to
Escape Hatch.
Listen to Escape Hatch. We're on a roll right now. Like we got Inception coming out.
All right.
Of course, got all of our coverage of Dune. If you're a Dune head, we've got episodes on every book from the original Herbert hexology. We've covered every Villeneuve movie ever made, including the ones in French.
Oh wow!
So yeah.
I didn't even know about that. Okay, I've seen Sicario.
Encendies is one of his French movies, and is it's a brutal movie. It's about like war crimes in a fictional Middle East country, and it's a tough hang, but beautiful movie.
Okay, everybody go listen to Escape Hatch.
Thank you,
Jason. It's been a real pleasure. All right. That was a lot of fun. I loved it. I hope you did too. Jason is obviously a super smart, super thoughtful, and funny guy. And so if you want more of that, do go check out Escape Hatch. They've recorded tons of episodes. They've been at this for quite a while. So I encourage you to check it out. And in fact, they actually also did an episode with Tim O'Reilly about Dune. So if you like my last episode and you want more, you can go check out their episode with Tim. If you're listening to this or watching this, I just want to thank you again for doing it. It means the world to me that people are interested in this. If you are interested in what I'm doing and you want to support this effort to get more technologists to talk about literature and to bring discussions of the humanities into the tech sphere, there are a couple things you can do to help. One, just share it with your friends. Let other people know about what I'm doing here and have them, you can subscribe, have them subscribe, and we'll keep this thing going and spreading the word. That's how I want to grow this thing. If you have any other ideas, just write to me, jed@texontext.net. I'm open to suggestions on works we should cover, books or stories we should be talking about, guests I should have on the podcast. I really want to hear from you with suggestions on that. If you insist on opening your wallet, I can't actually take your money for Text on Text, but you can support Radiant Earth, which is a nonprofit that I run. That's a donation to Radiant Earth. It's not really to Text on Text, but it would mean a lot to me. You can go to radiant.earth/donate and support Radiant Earth's work there. Thanks to Secret School for composing the intro music to Text on Text. And this song that you're hearing right now is called 3/10 of the Population by We. Links to both are in the show notes. One bit of housekeeping. I'm going to start including a list of upcoming episodes on the website. So if you go to texontext.net, you'll be able to see what's coming up. This is just to give people a heads up in case they want to read in advance. We're going to have one more episode about Dune next month. And then the month after that, we're going to talk about a Jorge Luis Borges story called On Exactitude in Science. So you'll be able to see what's coming up on the site. Do check it out. And I look forward to seeing you in about a month to talk about Dune one more time. Thanks.